Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our just general joy of being alive. And of course, we talk about sustainable design. And today, I've got the easiest introduction I've ever made. Today, I have Alison Brooks on the show. Alison, welcome. It's an absolute joy to have you here.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's just so wonderful. Let's start by talking about you, is the way I always start the show. I want to know a little bit about your background, but the first question is, what drove you towards architecture? Why did you become an architect?
Well, I think it was a combination of factors. I sort of grew up in an environment, actually in Southern Ontario, where the value of craftsmanship and beauty and even historic architecture was something that my mother in particular really enjoyed and cared about and took pains to show me, just point out beautiful farmhouses and, the clubhouses, even the Welland Club, I think. And in Toronto, some of the great examples of sort of Richardsonian Romanesque or, Gothic buildings at University of Toronto. It wasn't like a mission, but it was something that was sort of present, this sort of instinct to show me and my sisters sort of the beauty of the built environment, even though she never said to me, like, why don't you become an architect one day? And then in addition to that, I always felt that I wanted to be a professional, that I wanted to be self-sufficient and be able to take my expertise with me wherever I might end up in life. And so this combination of sort of being determined to be a professional and bring together the arts and culture and history into my working life, architecture was a perfect fit. So I kind of put that all together when I was about 16, I think, was when I knew.
Right. So let's talk about the influences. So who influenced you, what people influenced you, and what trends influenced you to move towards the styles that you've developed and the methodologies that you've developed?
Well, I was educated in the 1980s and I studied architecture at University of Waterloo, which is a great school of architecture, great university. And at that time, I think there was a shift, a kind of paradigm shift in architecture from away from modernism to postmodernism and postmodern classicism. And there was this kind of battle between the kind of purist modernists and the legacy of Mies van der Rohe and early Le Corbusier, the international style, versus the school of thinking which was trying to bring history and classicism in particular into the fold of what contemporary architecture should be delivering. Waterloo was allied with the modernist legacy, I would say. And so in terms of the contemporary architects who influenced me at the time, probably OMA, Rem Koolhaas. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright is ever present, I think, for any North American architect. But later on, I came to be more interested in the architects of the sort of organic school, like Hans Scharoun or Hugo Haring, the kind of German school of expressionism, and maybe even the later Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright work, which was very eclectic, very sculptural. And yeah, that was probably the shift. But, it's been a very interesting time in architecture over the last 40 years because it's sort of gone from modernism and there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of mistakes made in the post-war period in terms of imposing modernist kind of monocultures onto and systems onto cities and campuses and neighborhoods. And now there's much more diversity, much more plurality. Architects, and myself included, basically have made it a mission to respond to the places that we work. So every project is unique, every project is a form of cultural research, and I try to embed those stories and meanings and histories into my work.
Yeah.
So it's a big shift from the modernist kind of ideology, the dogma of the 20th century.
Yeah, I love the diversity that's happening today. It's just magical. Would you say that you remain with any particular style? Is there an Alison Brooks look? When I look, I see a lot of diversity and eclectic design in the works that I've seen of yourself. Would you label a style that is your own?
I don't think I would try. I really do try to respond to each project in a unique way. I think it's a problem to fall into a sort of formula that isn't responsive. Some people describe my work as sculptural, which I consider a compliment because I think any architects wish to achieve the kind of purism and sort of clarity of sculpture, modern sculpture in particular. But at the same time, I'm very interested in materials and even ornament and iconography and bringing those kind of craft or arts and craft based into contemporary architecture, into contemporary form.
Beautiful.
What makes a home truly extraordinary? Not just how it looks, but how it feels. Solera Reserve transforms daylight into soft, comfortable light, privacy without blinds, beauty without compromise. By day, refined and luminous. By night, an unforgettable glow. Solera Reserve, luxury glass, designed for living. Learn more at advancedglazings.com/Solera Reserve.
All right, let's talk about some of the prizes you've won, and for a purpose. Besides, let's celebrating your accomplishments. I do have a goal. So you've received the Sterling Prize, the Manser Medal, and this is only a partial list: the Reba House of the Year, the Stephen Lawrence Prize. Now, two of those awards, the Sterling and the Manser, they're both meant to celebrate innovation in architecture. What innovations did you bring to your work that put you in a position to receive those awards? Did they tell you, or do you know what it was, that newness and the freshness that you brought to your design that made people recognize the innovation?
Well, innovation is a pretty broad term because there's sort of technical innovation, especially in architecture. There's technical innovation, there's spatial innovation, there's innovation in the way you work with landscape. There's many different ways one can innovate. And I think for those two projects, for example, the Sterling Prize, that was for a project that was part of a large housing scheme, a 400 home housing development in Cambridge. I collaborated with two other architects. I designed 40 of the homes within the development, and the buildings I designed were semi-detached houses, two pairs of semi-detached houses and an apartment building. And I think both of those projects, I was trying to kind of reimagine familiar typologies. And I'm sorry about using the word typology, but sort of familiar building types, such as the semi-detached house, which is a sort of ubiquitous form of housing here in the UK, pair of houses with a shared party wall. And I tried to bring the sort of eclectic and sort of quite exuberant type of sort of roof forms and window patterns to the exterior of the building, but also completely reimagine the way the house works internally. So it's an atrium house. It has a 3-story atrium at the center of the house, and it's also split level. So the 3 stories at the front are a half level higher than the 3 levels at the back. And So you have a story and a half high living room and a dining room at the middle of the house, which has, a 3-story atrium. And all of the spaces of the house kind of revolve around this atrium space. And then it also had a family room up under the roof, a huge family room. So it was really trying to take what could be a very standard house form and completely reimagine the way the house is organized. And really, that was about bringing people together, so instead of being cut off from other family members when you're on the upper floors, you can always have that visual connection across the atrium and feel more connected to people in the house and to pull light into the center of the plan. I have a mission of designing buildings where you never have to turn the lights on during the day. You've just got to maximize natural daylight, and an atrium is one way of doing it. Very high ceilings is another way of doing it. Double story spaces. We just really need natural light and feeling connected to the exterior to help us feel better.
Oh my gosh, I talk about this constantly on the show. I bring people on to talk about the importance of the connections, the importance of the natural light, the importance of fresh air, all of those things. Our connection to the outside world has been, severed over these past few decades. And it's just wonderful to hear you talk about bringing it back. I have to ask though, is there private space built into that, a place where we can escape and get away from
Yes,
the world?
absolutely. I mean, in this idea of an atrium house, although the ground floor, a lot of it is open plan, on the upper stories, there's a kind of gallery that separates the bedrooms from the atrium. And so you can just shut the door into your bedrooms or shut the door up to the loft and create those worlds of privacy and seclusion, but always have the opportunity to be connected, to see what's going on downstairs or upstairs, and to see the sky. I'm also obsessed with being able to see the sky. And so I always introduce roof lights so that even, it's not always about the view, it's about connecting to this incredible atmosphere, the sky, stars, seeing the sun track its light across the floor. You just get different kinds of experiences of light coming into a building or a home when you use roof lights in a kind of careful way.
I don't want to turn this into too much of a geeky episode, but we are finding so much about how badly humans need light, and we need to feel it tracking, and we need to feel the spectrum change slightly as, it moves across the sky and as it descends into red towards the evening. All of those things are absolutely critical to our health. So, absolutely wonderful to hear you speaking about it, not just for the beauty, but there's a whole health aspect in there as well. So yeah, congratulations to you on that. I want to change gears a little bit. I want to make sure that we talk about the Cohen Quad at Exeter College for sure. First of all, I love the respect for that traditional quadrangle structure. Again, you can see that it's designed with connectivity top of mind for, within the community and from the college to the community. And most of all, I just love the shapes. And somebody said your work involves sculpture. This is such a great example on it. Now, there's a worry these days, and I share it, that we're focusing so much on energy that we are now starting to create some pretty boring, dull buildings, first of all, engineering-driven buildings rather than, architecturally driven buildings. And also that in order to maximize energy efficiency, we're starting to isolate people from the natural world. Do you share this worry? And if so, what do you think we can do to build more structures like the Cohen Quad in order to, maintain those so important connections?
Yes, there is a huge need to produce a built environment that is not dependent on fossil fuels, that we address the climate crisis. And one of the ways of doing that is reducing overheating. That seems to even be more important now than keeping the cold out and the heat in. It's relatively easy today to keep buildings warm, but actually stopping them from overheating is harder, as the climate warms up. And, even in the UK, where there's very little air conditioning, the summers are hotter and longer, and shading systems, any kind of passive way of cooling buildings seems to be the bigger challenge. So, but in terms of designing buildings so that they are performing without a lot of sort of add-ons or technologies, which are really expensive, it is about making buildings that are more solid. And instead of, glass boxes, now it's sort of back to the idea of a solid building that you then puncture with windows, with openings that are sort of carefully proportioned and designed in a way that they create a good pattern. And patterning of windows, I think, is going to become much more important now with, for example, condominium towers. I mean, I would never design a 100% glass condominium tower. I don't think that's the right way to approach tall building design. And it's horribly inefficient for energy, both in terms of overheating and for insulation value. So if we start working with solid envelopes, how do you make a good window? How do you design it so that it in itself has very good proportions, but then when you repeat it, how does it result in a pattern and a design that somehow feels beautiful or right? And I think this also connects to sort of deep human instincts. We respond to patterns. There are patterns in nature. There is repetition and patterns in, plant forms, in animal furs and feathers. There are the most beautiful
Scales.
patterns in scales. And
Mm.
how do we create beautiful patterns in architecture? And so it's sort of learning to work with solidity and openings in a way that we lost maybe in the 20th century when there was this huge drive towards everything being 100% transparent, 100% glass, which meant somehow it was modern and it was clean and this flow between inside and outside. But I think we kind of reached peak glass in terms of architecture, sort of 100% glass architecture, probably when the sort of realization of the climate crisis really kicked in. And we're having to relearn the lessons of sort of pre-industrial revolution architecture when we didn't have lights to turn on, we didn't have electricity, we had to work with natural materials, with local materials, maximize light, and create spaces with more volume and more height, which is also part of sort of well-being. That, volume, highly generous, high volume, high ceiling spaces tend to make us feel better, and they're more adaptable for different uses. And this is something that 18th and 19th or even 17th century architects got right, because they tried to always maximize ceiling height to allow more daylight into the buildings they were building. So it's really kind of unlearning a bit of the last 100 years and rethinking the way we work with mass and solidity and transparency.
I love it. Okay, there's two things I want to follow up on that. So this is kind of a technical issue, but let me ask it. When we're into the world of a punch-out window, you have the potential for glare, right? And glare will result in people putting blinds on those windows, and the blinds will be different in each window. It kind of garbles the pattern, right? A little bit. How do you manage that? What techniques have you used to make sure that blinds don't end up, throwing off the rhythm?
Well, one thing we've done with our developer, sort of housing developer clients, is we've made sure that the homes are delivered with blinds already installed, so that basically every home, and especially with apartment buildings, they come with a blind so that people don't have to buy curtains and have to buy blinds or install vertical blinds, which generally make any building look like an office building.
Right.
Doesn't matter what it is, if it has vertical blinds, that's what happens. So we try to design as much into the building as possible in the first place to allow residents or occupants to reduce the glare. We also set the windows very deep in our facades. So normally our windows are set back about 300 mil, like a foot into the facade. And that's because here in the UK, wall buildups are approaching 1.5 feet thick because of the insulation requirements. So we've got all this wonderful thick wall to work with, which means we can set the windows deep into the facade, and that's very helpful for opening the window when it's raining. It also creates automatic shading. It helps with privacy, and you get the beautiful shading and shadows from deep set windows, which I think also convey permanence and solidity. This is a building with good thick walls, and it's going to be there for a few hundred years, I hope.
Right. Right. I like that. All right. Now let's talk about organic materials just briefly. Are you working with any organic materials at all? Have you introduced that into your palette?
Well, I like to think that brick is an organic material. Brick and
Sure.
stone are, at least brick is an earth-based material, and it's highly recyclable. It's virtually 100% recyclable.
Right.
It's great because it's got thermal mass. Clay, you can do wonderful things with brick as a module, brick patterning, coursing. Stone we'd love to work with stone more because it's actually the lowest carbon building you can work with because it's just more or less carbon in itself. It's like a block of carbonized matter, but the coring process is quite expensive. I work with a lot of timber. I try to work with mass timber as much as possible. And so here in the UK, that includes, glue lamp columns and beams and cross-laminated timber. And I also work with hardwoods like cherry. I mostly use American black cherry when I do interior joinery and sort of like special projects. I love that, the grain and the texture and the sheen of American black cherry, and hardwoods are a super sustainable source, renewable source of construction material, but also craft.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Right. Okay, so my next question, you've kind of answered already, so I'm going to try to change it on the fly here a little bit. I want to talk in the context of your quarter house in Folkestone, with great example of, you've ensured the structures got strong tie to the community, respecting, the existing buildings while moving into something more modern. And there's a lot of glass in it. Right. There's a whole lot of glass in that building. And as you'd mentioned, given the focus on energy consumption now, would you use less glass next time? Would you make any changes? And if so, what changes would you make given where we are with building codes and our concerns about energy management?
Well, I think in terms of the overall building envelope, I'd be surprised if there was even 20% glass, actually, because it's only one facade that's highly glazed, which is the street facade, and the way it turns the corner. And that glazing on the ground floor is for the foyer, and on the first floor, it's for the restaurant and bar. And it was intended as a kind of living room to the city, very visible from the street. If I was to design it today, probably the walls would be thicker, just in terms of building code. And perhaps there would be, we did introduce skylights. The top floor is offices. It's now the headquarters of the Creative Foundation. And I wish the roof space was a little bit more usable. I don't know. We sort of also designed it so that it could expand in the future, that it could have a kind of rooftop pavilion and kind of rehearsal spaces. But I wouldn't change much, to be honest. I think it's a very hardworking building. Everybody loves it. It's still the kind of cultural hub of folks. And it's a pretty robust building.
I guess the Canadian boy should have checked on the pronunciation of Folkestone versus Folkestone.
Oh, right. Well, that's a minefield.
Forgive me on that one.
That's okay.
I want to speak about one of your quotes. I found this one. It said, "Housing is the social project of architecture. It frames everyday life. It forms people's worldview." Can you elaborate on that a little bit and help me understand how, it forms people's worldview and frames our everyday life, our homes?
Sure. I really do believe that we should consider housing civic building. it is as important as the types of buildings that we would consider civic, like libraries or concert halls or even schools. There's much more housing that fills our environment, urban environment, townscapes. There's much more of housing than any other building type. And so it plays a hugely important role in our daily experience of a place, of, down to the neighborhoods we inhabit, the streets we use. It's very public, it's super public, and I believe affects how we feel about ourselves because it's part of what creates our home. And probably one of the most important words in the English language or in any language is the word home. And without a home, I think humans as a species feel lost. Everyone needs a home. And so it's this combination of something that serves our personal needs at such a fundamental level, at a physical environment, also as a social environment, but also as a collective environment, that the homes that we build, the neighborhoods that we build, the streets that we share, this is what makes our world, our physical world. And so the quality of that space, how it's maintained, how it's designed, the proportions, they all communicate to us value and or lack of value or care. I think it's very legible. People can really feel when places are neglected or not cared for or mean or small. And they can also feel when places feel generous and beautiful and well maintained and long lasting. So, it's completely integrated, I think, this idea of housing being a social project, being a civic project, being not only our home, but a way of understanding our value in society. The built environment communicates that to us every day.
Does social justice play into that, Alison?
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons I've spent a lot of effort in the sphere of social housing here in the UK and estate regeneration. So the housing projects that were built in the 1960s and 70s in particular, which have sort of failed as projects, they've been sort of socially economically segregated parts of the cities. It's here, particularly in Europe, where there was a lot of bombing, and then the post-war reconstruction tended to build sort of a system build project with hundreds or sometimes even thousands of units all in one place, and sort of turning their back on the city around them, turning their back on the streets, a very car-centric idea of urban design, a sort of a rejection of the traditional city and the relationship between the housing structure and the street and the city around it. So a lot of the work I've done in the last 20 years has been working on projects that try to repair and restore, good quality housing within those contexts of sort of 1960s and 70s social housing projects, and creating a mixed environment that's more inclusive and open, and reconnecting the streets and, neighborhood grain to its surrounding. So it's been about, I see that as social justice, sort of reintegrating deprived areas into the city so that you can no longer see where they start or stop. They just become part of this network, which is much more healthy and integrated.
Yeah, like John McKnight's writing. It's just beautiful.
Yes. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Okay, I want to talk about beauty for a second. You talk about beauty often. I read an interview you did in 2022 with Arc Daily, and you were asked to elaborate on several of your quotes. One of those quotes was to insist on beauty. Love that. It certainly caught my eye. Okay, so building codes, back to building codes again. A little bit of an obsession with me. How do you continue to be able to create beauty with, the intense codes that are all about energy? Give us some, tips or tricks for younger architects as to how you hold on to that ideal while still being forced to meet some pretty intense codes. Or can we flip those codes to our advantage?
Well, this is a great question. It's a great challenge I think we have as architects in today's climate, not just environmental climate, but economic climate. There are a lot of factors that on the face of it are working against beauty. And yeah, so I think a lot of what can be achieved in architecture is sort of finding those moments in a project that convey generosity. And by that, I mean spaces like threshold spaces, like porches or verandas, or sort of interstitial spaces that provide a bit of generosity in terms of places to dwell or pause or take a moment to make a decision, to cross that threshold, to go through that front door. How do we celebrate those moments? And often things like thresholds and porches and porticos are not in a client brief. So as an architect, you have to bring them to the project, like just make the case for a really beautiful place for people to pause and take shelter at that threshold moment before they enter the building. And then that becomes a kind of architectural opportunity. And, I don't think there's anybody who doesn't like a beautiful threshold moment in, in their daily life. So it's sort of tapping into these things that everybody can relate to and sort of pushing for them. Another thing is just having certain principles. Like I try to make every corridor a place. I think corridors are kind of a bad thing. It's a sort of ugly name and it's super functionalist, and it's just sort of like a conduit to get people from A to B. But if you reimagine corridors as places to dwell and stay, as a lounge or with window seats or with little pockets and gathering spaces or niches, suddenly the corridor becomes a wonderful place. And you're sort of optimizing that circulation. I mean, the other bad word is circulation. I just don't think there should ever be a space that is only doing one thing, which is circulation. We should try to think of every space as having more potential to, accommodate people and to allow people to gather and or spend some time connecting to the exterior. We often, as you say, we cut off experience of the neighborhood, of the context, of the weather by just having terrible dead end corridors and huge blank facades. And, having a certain rule, like I will never do a dead end corridor and I will never do a circulation space that only does one thing. And I will never design a building that has 8-foot ceilings. Like I will always fight for 9 and 10 or 15-foot ceilings because they just make everyone feel better, and they also result in a more beautiful facade. They work in that one principle can operate at many different levels and is part of a sort of overall idea of how architecture can help people's well-being and productivity, happiness, healthiness, all of these things, bringing people together in new ways. This is our role as architects working at any scale.
Oh, that was a beautiful answer. Thank you for that. All right, Alison, we're getting close to the end. There is a question that I ask in every episode. Every single guest gets asked this question, and I ask them to answer it from whatever perspective that they like. Okay? What makes a great building?
I think a great building makes you feel good about yourself, about the place where you are, and conveys generosity, conveys a certain kind of timelessness and permanence, and that can adapt over time. I think so many of the buildings that we love, historic buildings, they've adapted to new uses. And they've been able to adapt because they are robust, because they are generous, because they do have these fantastic uplifting spaces. And often they have craft and ornament and, signs of human skill and artfulness that's embedded in the building itself. I think all of those things are part of what a great building is. And our challenge is to make that happen in a context that is, much more demanding in terms of how we can achieve those things within the constraints that we work with today. But I do think it's possible, and it's always exciting to be in this profession, to find these new clients, these new contexts that spark that creativity combined with innovation, combined with history, remembering the beautiful places and experiences we've had and bringing them together in new form.
I love it. Okay, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to share? Any exciting announcements or anything that the world should hear about, Alison?
Well, we're expanding. The office is growing. We're probably going to double, I hope, in the next year or two. We're expanding our office space itself. So I'm bucking the trend in terms of people shrinking their offices. I'm growing the office. I think it's really important that people come together face to face in 3 dimensions and have that, we're able to look into each other's eyes and make those human connections that make life worth living. And we're also publishing a book about Windward House, the RBA House of the Year that you mentioned earlier. We're going to launch a new website and hopefully starting on site with a couple of projects in Toronto and some towers here in London. So yeah, it's a really exciting year ahead for ABA. And we're shortlisted for the Banff Visitor Centre in Alberta. So that's super exciting.
Beautiful place to design. My goodness, what a background you have to work with there.
Yeah, it's spectacular. Really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Alison, thank you so much. I can't tell you how wonderful it's been to be able to speak with you and hear you share your views and your ideas. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
All right, you take care.
Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.